Yes, let's continue.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Rockman, we are now going to just try and understand whether Section 38(2) of the PFMA was complied with by the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. And if not, what steps were taken by Provincial Treasury to deal with this irregularity? It may not just be Provincial Treasury. You may want to indicate other institutions within the regulatory framework that are supposed to monitor and correct non-compliance. So, are you ready?
Yes.
The focal provisions that relate to your oversight functions are found in, if I'm not wrong, Chapter 3. Yes, Chapter 3 of the PFMA. I don't know if you don't really need the Act, but I can take you to it if you think you might want to use it. Are you all right without it?
Yes.
It's in the legislative bundle under tab 3.
Okay.
But shall we just continue? You'll tell me if you want to actually
Yes,
pull
thank you.
the Act out. At, of course, Section 17 and 18 deal with your powers and functions, both as MEC and what you're able to delegate to others. The other important provision we are going to deal with, so I think the most important thing really about Section 17, let's just pause here for a minute, is 17.2, which says the MEC for Finance, as the head of a provincial treasury, takes the policy and other decisions of the Treasury, except those decisions taken as a result of a delegation or instruction in terms of Section 20. You are the head of the Provincial Treasury. That's the most important thing about Section 17. Am I correct?
Well,
Yes,
you mean
as
she
the-
was.
Yes.
Well, yes, in
Yeah.
your capacity at
Yes.
the time. In your capacity,
But
yes,
not
Chairman.
at, sorry, Chair, not at the time,
In
of-
2013, as of April 2013. Let's
as
be
of
very
March
specific.
2013, but not as of June 2012.
Absolutely. June 2012, you were still in the Premier's office.
Yes.
That's correct. And in fact, that's part of the difficulty, because I tend to ask you questions that speak to 2012, whereas quite frankly, there are questions that relate to 2013. So whenever I do that, just bring us back to the correct time frame and simply say, I will relate to what happened in 2013 when I was MEC for Finance. And that will then contextualize properly your answer.
Thanks, Chair.
But of course, you may ask some questions when she was not MEC of Finance, if you want information that could be expected of, that she could be expected to know because of her experience as both DG of the province and MEC Finance.
Indeed,
in
so,
terms of
Chairman.
procedures and so on. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then she can throw light on the basis of what she knows, even if she was not occupying the particular position.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's useful to contextualize this round of evidence by just reminding you about what Mr. Jankelson said. He essentially said, and it was not only about you, it was about the Premier and other members of EXCO, that in your capacity as members of EXCO, and he names you MEC of Finance as well in that grouping, that you were one of the individuals who was, and I quote, pertinently aware of the issues and problems relating to Estina, and in spite of that, allowed substantial payments to be made towards this project while being pertinently aware of these issues. Close quotes, that's the one comment. He goes on, I'd really paraphrase his other comments. He goes on to intimate that you were aware of the skewed allocation of shares to Estina and the fact that Estina never contributed any of its own funds. He also points out that the contract was drafted in the office of the Premier. Last, he goes on to say, and I haven't taken everything out of his transcript verbatim, but this is the last section that I'd like to add. He also says that you were aware that there were no beneficiaries in this project. And I suppose this is an important point because the conditional grant allocations relevant here, the CASP allocation, and to the extent that it was used, the Ilima Litsema allocation, that Mrs. Elder Mchiza testified about at this commission, would have been processed through the Provincial Treasury. If I might just add to this list of indicators that Mr. Jankelson placed on record, is that you were a member of EXCO when the FDC, the Free State Development Corporation, was appointed to take over from Estina. Now, Mr. Jankelson noted that substantial funds were paid to FDC and its agent, ECHU. So when we look at these comments, they really give context to the questions that are going to follow. And they are comments made to you in your capacity as MEC for Finance. The first comment really relates to how aware you were of the issues that bedeviled this particular contract. I don't know if you want to very briefly touch on that, knowing that you are still going to come back to dealing specifically with the 104 million that had to be found for each year for Estina. What's your response to Mr. Jankelson?
Thank you, Chair. I think in my initial communication with the Commission, I also indicated that I think Mr. Jankelson was relying on a National Treasury investigation report with a certain date, which he appears to have knowledge of, which we never had a copy of. And I indicated in the subsequent financial years, the audit reports of each and every one of those financial years, the Auditor General reflected that that investigation had not been concluded. So I don't know what else Mr. Jankelson was relying on.
Can I interrogate just that first portion?
Yeah.
Are you saying that you did not have sight of that report at any point in time? It's actually a report that's dated February 2014. There are some versions that dated 2013. That's an incorrect date. The correct date is February 2014. That's the first fact. The second one that I really want you to respond to is when the public protector made inquiries about this matter, the Premier responded and gave a response that indicated that he was aware of the report and had read the report, which is why he was able to respond to it. Would you not have been in his office at that point in time, or would you not have been aware of that report having been sent to the Premier?
Thank you, Chair. If the report is somewhere in 2013, what I remember is that the Provincial Accountant General at the time, Mrs. Fourie, who has given evidence, I think it was around October 2013, she made us aware that she was requested to meet with the investigators appointed by National Treasury. So certainly at the time, by then, the investigation was still in progress. The HOD Treasury later requested information from Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry about the progress of the investigation, because National Treasury never communicated with us directly.
Who is us?
Provincial Treasury.
Thank you.
This is now after I had become the MEC Finance. They never communicated with us as Provincial Treasury on any aspect of the investigation, asking us for information, asking us for assistance. They communicated directly with the Provincial Department of Agriculture, so we were left in the dark. Equally, whether it was a preliminary report or a final report was issued, National Treasury never asked us for comments on the report, they never asked us for input. The report was never referred by the Premier to Provincial Treasury either.
Was it not discussed at EXCO at all?
It was never tabled in EXCO for any form of discussion. Neither was the investigation or a draft report by the Public Protector. It was not referred to Provincial Treasury. It was never tabled in the Executive Council.
Can I ask you to pause again? Would it have been quite regular for the Premier to have discussed this particular report with EXCO at one of the EXCO meetings?
It is difficult to say. Some reports on forensic investigations, some were presented, some were not presented. If it was a report on, I could remember specific municipalities that was placed under administration, those type of reports would mostly, or generally, it would go to EXCO and be presented. But the others, on specific matters, it might not be.
The fact that the Public Protector got involved in this particular matter, again, would not necessarily mean that it would come before EXCO in any form.
No, it would not.
I ask these questions because I know you would have been DG at the time, but there was quite a bit of irregular conduct stroke expenditure in that period spanning 2011-2012 that the Free State government was aware of. It was brought to the attention of the relevant parties. Or am I wrong?
Chair, if you are referring to, I think the one big problem that the Free State had was the 23 Rhodes Project. That was around 2009-10.
Yes.
And then around 20...
Just elaborate for the chairman what that particular project would have been about.
It was a project initiated by the Department of Police Rhodes Transport, where we either rebuilt or upgraded 23 roads simultaneously. It was pretty much a similar problem at that time as ultimately Vrede Dairy. It was not fully budgeted for. So the project started, funding was committed, and when it came to payment, obviously, we ran into trouble. Then a year later, it was the advance payment to material suppliers.
Material suppliers to which
human
project?
Settlements, sorry. To human settlements.
Human
the
settlements.
Department of Human Settlements.
In what
yes.
amount? What were the amounts involved
No.
there?
I can't remember the
Roughly.
exact amount, but it was substantial because it was the human settlements grant, conditional grant funding that we were at risk of losing. I think it was close to R1 billion probably. It was a substantial amount of money. That led to Cabinet invoking Section 100A of the Constitution. Is that December 2011, I think? Because the Minister of Finance then issued a directive to the Premier January 2012, if I'm correct, indicating that certain measures had to be taken to ensure that the provincial government comply with standard provisions of the PFMA, that certain performance audits had to be undertaken in departments. I think it included police, roads, transport, human settlements, and education. There was quite a number of issues that the minister covered in that directive.
Yes. So those were the two large areas where there were irregularities, and national government then put the Free State government on terms and asked you to essentially monitor what was going on and correct what was going on.
That is correct. It was not only the Free State at the time. It was the Section 101A interventions was Free State and Gauteng Health, I think, and Limpopo was 100B.
Yes. You mentioned these in your supplementary
Yes.
affidavit.
Yes.
So, Chairman, you'll find the reference to the fact that there was this directive made in terms of Section 101A of the Constitution that impacted on the Free State. And this is why I asked the question. And what worries me about the fact that the irregularities seem to recur. You'd been put on terms as the Free State government. Here we've got yet another project. It might not be as large as the 1 billion project, but it's a substantial project in its own right, the Estina project. And again, you have irregularities that occur. I would put that to you, because again, Section 38(2) was not complied with. And this is what Mr. Jankelson is in effect saying, that you were aware that there were problems, but did nothing about it.
Chief, if you could clarify, we were aware of the broader problems around the issues of budget not being fully secured before a project commences. Yes, indeed. Whether we were aware of the operational details of the Vrede Dairy project, that is not something Treasury would have been aware of. We did the oversight visit in May 2013. I indicated it seemed like a project that has commenced. Various aspects were in progress. It is not Treasury's responsibility to monitor the day-to-day running of projects. You would imagine when we deal with transfer payments, we transfer hundreds of millions every year to non-profit organizations. We do not go out as Treasury and monitor whether each and every one of those ECDs, for example, early childhood development centers, whether they exist. We simply don't have the capacity. So the monitoring and evaluation responsibility remains that of the contracting department, and the contracting department was agriculture. By signing off on each and every invoice, they signed off, they confirmed, goods and services rendered. They have complied with all provisions of the PFMA. The Executive Council functions as a collective leadership. There's no superpower except maybe the Premier. There's no MEC that is individually going to stand up and say, we have a problem with this project, let's stop it. Or go outside the Executive Council that consistently approved and supported the project, and then say, no, we are acting on our own. I remember clearly the project as presented in June 2012. The MEC Finance at the time was in the meeting. I'm quite convinced the HOD was in the meeting. They did not object to the approving the memorandum at the time. They would not go afterwards and say, we now object to the project. They would not act outside the collective.
You see, I really want to just tease this out a little more, because I've now found that Myberg document that we were talking about before lunch. And I also have, I think it's your ER 102, and I think ER 103, that's from your original bundle, and that will be in bundle C. 103 is also a further report, I think, by Mr. Moses regarding that visit. Now, if you will recall, really, the bad press around the Vrede Dairy project really only emerged in early 2013. All was quiet in 2012. It's with that media report and with the Treasury and its investigation that people started asking questions, and that would have been in 2013. You would agree with that? I call it let me call it the bad press in inverted commas around what was happening at the project. You then followed on in March with your own visit in 2013 as well.
In May.
In May, I beg
Yeah.
your pardon. But in January 2013, Mr. Myburg, and here he's part of the Budget Management Directorate. That's your ER 102 at page 1220. So that would be at volume C of your original affidavit. I'm going to wait for you to find it. Your original affidavit,
Yeah.
you've got 3 volumes to it, A, B, and C, HH 13. It should be on the table. So volume C of that is what you're looking for.
Look at the spine.
HH 13, volume C, and that's page 1220 is where the letter starts. I'm really just going to go straight through to the findings, which are on page 1221. In January 2013.
Yes, I'm there. Thanks.
Can I also confirm that Mr. Myburg sat in Provincial Treasury?
Yes, although I was not there at the time, but I can confirm he was there.
In Provincial Treasury, yes, absolutely. You arrived much later. And he says here that, 1, the land on which the project is to be developed belongs to the municipality, and there are currently still valid lease contracts to other commercial farmers in the area. The contract will only expire in August 2014, and no progress was made to buy out these contracts. The project managers can therefore not do any developments on the land until such time that the issue is resolved. We've had corroboration of this particular fact in other evidence that we have put to Mr. Tabete. Second, a total area of about 151 hectares have, however, been planted with maize and beans. These crops will be cut and used as silage, in brackets feed, for the cows when they arrive. So that you would call progress. Number 3, some money was spent on the purchasing of tractors and implements. 2 tractors were purchased with implements for them to work on the farm. That you would tick off as progress. 4, no permission is granted up to date by the municipality for the project managers to start drilling for water, in brackets boreholes, in the area where the actual dairy, and in brackets milking parlor, etc., will be established. Problem. No water, no farm. Number 5, the dam wall close to this area is on the verge of collapsing, but repairs cannot be made without permission from the municipality. Problem. 6, some groundwork was done only to the extent of leveling a piece of land where the actual construction of the silage storage facility is supposed to be constructed. Work has, however, come to a standstill and no actual work is being done as we speak. Problem. 7, rough estimates would be that an amount of approximately 6 to 7 million could actually be verified as expenditure on the project. This would include the above-mentioned progress as well as salaries for staff currently employed on the farm. Now, this is a report that speaks to the situation at the farm in January 2013. And I bear in mind that in April already, Mr. Gupta is asking where the rest of the 84 million is. These are the types of facts that Mr. Jankelson drew on. I'm not saying this report, just the types of facts that he used to inform his view that you were aware that there were problems, you as in the collective view, but did nothing or very little about it.
I'm not able to comment on how this report was processed at the time internally in Treasury. What I do know is in April, when the department approached us with the request for payment, for further payments, I had a discussion with the former HOD of Treasury, Mr. Gomongwe, at the time. who did raise issues around the January report. We then established, fine, from agriculture, certain documents had been produced. I think they had forwarded the feasibility study, whatever other requirements that was agreed to in June 2012, the prior year. It was subsequently submitted. But then we had agreed to do a further site visit to establish in May now what was actually happening on the farm. So that was, but we were sufficiently comfortable that most of the January concerns by then had been addressed to some extent or was in the process of being addressed, that it was not necessary to take any other actions at that point in time.
Now, the report you speak of, the May report, would that be the one that was authored by Mr. I.J. Moses? The date is the 22nd of May 2013. Does that sound familiar? It's ER 103, the very next document in that file.
I'm sorry, in which file are you?
File C,
Yeah.
your original affidavit. This is an annexure to that. So the one we've just been reading from was 102. That was the one Myberg had presented. And the very next one is 103, ER 103. The page number is 1226. And it's titled Preliminary Financial Report on Mohuma Mobung, and in brackets, Vrede Project.
Chair, no, there's a different report. I think it was drafted by Mr. Leboni that directly speaks to the site visit. This was a different financial report. The site visit report of Mr. Leboni did not cover all aspects of finances. This is an additional report.
But this is one that you've annexed to your papers, and it's one that says the purpose of this preliminary report is to provide the Honorable MEC for Finance with the following information regarding Premier Dairy Project. Project background, cost and funding implications, progress on to date. That's what's written in paragraph 1 at page 1226.
Yes, Chair, you are correct. In my main affidavit on ECR 0106, the report I'm referring to about the site visit of Vrede Dairy 23 May is ER 43.
ER 43.
Yeah.
I have it. Yes, please point out the salient portions of ER 43 that you want the chairman to note. Again, the purpose essentially is the same, exactly what Mr. Moses had written. Purpose of the report is to provide the Honorable MEC of Finance and the CEO Provincial Treasury with the following regarding Vrede Dairy Project, in brackets, Mohuma Mobung. Project's background.
I think, hang on, she's still trying to
I'm so
find it.
lost with this document that I don't know where you are.
The page number is written in red.
I
And
think
it's-
maybe start with the exhibit name on the spine so that she checks whether she has got the right file.
It's file,
Look at the spine of the file.
and it will be file B.
B.
Yes. And it's written in red, the page numbers are written in red, it's 563.
Yes. Chair, I'm with you.
You found it?
Yes.
Okay.
So you are pointing to this as a report that you can relate to.
Yes, this is, I was with Mr. Leboni, Mr. Moses. There was a whole delegation of Treasury officials
Yes.
that was at the site of Vrede Dairy. It sets out the basic financial information. It sets out what paragraph 9 of that report says. The 30 million was required to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Land
Now-
acquisition,
Continue.
land acquisition, environmental impact assessment, feasibility study, and so forth.
Now, remember, we spoke about this earlier on, about the disjuncture between what Mr. Tabecha thought the money, the first 30 million was for, and what Estina thought the first 30 million was for. But continue, at least here, this corroborates what you said to the chairman earlier on.
Yes.
This is exactly what you said.
We would not have information about what Estina alleges they were supposed to do with the money. We are stuck with the version that agriculture tells us in whatever submission they made, they must do 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
Then paragraph 14 deals with the progress on site. Then they do say, paragraph 15, 55 million was spent at the end of June 2013. The physical progress on site seems to be sluggish due to the fact that bulk of the funds were meant for parlour equipment which was ordered. The milking parlour equipment has not yet arrived, however the order has been made.
Yes, but if you just want to pause there for 1 minute, there's again a disjuncture between paragraph 15 and what you agreed in paragraph 9, huh?
Yeah.
You would agree that the two are completely different.
Yes, paragraph 9 is exactly what agriculture presented at the time they made the request for the first payment to be made. They said, we want to do X, Y, Z.
Yes.
Now we are on the site visit a couple of months later, May 2013.
Yes.
And we are told this is what has happened with the first payment
And you are told by who?
by the officials of agriculture.
And the project manager. I'm just
Yes.
wondering if the project manager
Yes,
who would have been on
the
site.
project manager was on the farm, but he was very difficult to understand. He spoke with a very heavy accent.
That's
so it
Mr.
was-
Prasad.
Yes, that's correct.
So your information really came from the departmental officials?
Yes,
The same people who'd given you the information in paragraph 9.
yes. That
Continue.
would be correct. Then it says the tractors that were purchased, the total area of land that has been planted, the harvesting machine, implements and other agriculture equipment. We were not doing a stock taking exercise. We would not go to that level of details. The construction of silage bunkers that was in progress on the day. The estimate was it was about 80% complete. Construction of dairy parlour was at an initial state. The milk processing plant was not yet started, as the latter is interdependent on completion of the dairy parlour and also relates to phase 2. Indication from project manager was that this project will gain momentum immediately once approval of usage of land for different purposes has been granted by National Department of Agriculture. And then it confirms the following obligations were executed: land acquisition, environmental impact, feasibility study. They were in the process of finalizing identification of beneficiaries for the Agri-BEE entity, and then there was a number of photos that indicates.
Yes.
Then the recommendations, it was noted the amount that's spent. It's noted that progress seemed to be sluggish because the land usage application had not yet been approved, and it recommended that we agree that we must make a follow-up visit during November 2013.
Now, this makes the precise point that Mr. Jankelson makes. At paragraph 20.1, you're correct. It notes that the total amount of 85 million has been spent thus far. Now, we know we can take 29 million off, let's call it 30 million off, because they said they put that away to reserve it for buying milking parlour equipment. You still have an amount of 55 million that is noted here as having been spent so far. And the simple point really is, could you see 55 million as you walked around that farm? That's really what the site visit was about. Could you see where the 55 million that you know had come from your coffers could possibly have been employed?
At that time, we knew that a significant portion of that money went into the studies. For example, feasibility study, environmental impact assessment. You would not expect to see that physically on the ground. The paperwork had been submitted and it was subsequently forwarded to Treasury. So it was submitted to Agriculture. What was on the ground was exactly as I said, it was a project in the beginning stages of implementation.
You know, can I ask you to pause? Because interestingly enough, that memorandum we showed you of the 28th of February that Mr. Tabete and MEC Zwane signed off on and sent through to the Premier, asking for authorization to go to India. In the third or fourth paragraph of that particular memo, Mr. Tabete mentioned 17 million that at that point in time was available for either for plans for 3 projects, Kwakwa, Sitsoto, and Vrede, or feasibility studies. There was a bit of a debate about what exactly that 17 million had been allocated to. But my understanding of Mr. Tabete's evidence is that that 17 million was in the bag. It had already been set aside for, whether it's for the plans or for the feasibility studies, is immaterial at this point in time. So when I then look at the 55 million that paragraph 20.1 would be referring to, should you take the 30 million off, I come back to asking, as Mr. Jankelson might have had he been here, could you see the South African taxpayers' 55 million on this farm that you were visiting?
Chair, for 2013-14 in the APP, there was 53.9 committed from CASP funding. That's the conditional grant funding.
In which year?
2013-14.
2013, I agree with you on that, yes.
And from infrastructure enhancement allocation, there was 60.
60?
Yeah, 60 million.
Yes.
So that constituted the full funding. It was taken up in the annual performance plan.
Yes.
In other words, it was approved by the National Department, at least the CASP funding of 53.950 million. It went through the whole process that they standardly followed. The Department of Agriculture would prepare a business plan, would submit to the assessment panel of the National Department. Projects some would be approved, some would be not approved. There would be certain conditions. So the funding was definitely secured.
Can I ask you to pause? Please don't forget where you're going to, because I'm simply reminding you that that letter that was written to the Premier asking for permission to go to India is dated the 28th of February 2012. At that point in time, this 53 million and the 60 million that CASP was giving for this particular project had not been allocated yet.
No.
You had not started having those discussions.
Yes.
And that's just the contrast I'm bringing. I'm simply saying, and I'm really looking at this letter, ER 43, at paragraph 20.1, at the 85 million minus 30, and really just asking, in this context, knowing that Tabete, he may have been wrong. Mr. Tabete said there's a 17 million. He said that to the Premier. The Premier signed off on that basis, gave him permission to go to India. There was a 17 million for the plan stroke feasibility study. At the same time, you here have paragraph 9 that speaks of 30 million for phase 1, which included a feasibility study. At paragraph 20.1, we've got 85 million, which includes the 30 million that has already been spent. This is what people are telling you, your oversight role. To what extent would you have to interrogate some of what you were seeing and hearing? I really don't know. I ask the question because I have not worked in provincial government. Otherwise, I would have had some sense.
Thanks, Jane. The 2011-12 budget was the limited one. It was one source of funding was 6 million. There were
Yes.
two sources of 3 million, of which one was EPWP.
So the total for 2011-2012 would have been
12
13.
million. 12 million in total.
12 million.
Yeah, it was 6 million from
I thought there was a 3.5 and a 6.5,
sorry,
and
that's
then
12,
another
13.
3.
Are you in 12, 13 now?
No, I'm simply working from memory because
Oh,
I've
okay.
been looking at these documents for a while.
2012, 13, from CASP there was 6 million.
Yes,
Then from Ilima Letsema there was 3 million.
yes,
And then from EPWP there was 3 million. So
Okay.
that gives you 12 million.
12.5.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, and that's for 2011-2012.
No, 2012, 2013.
2012-2013. 2012-2013. Are you,
2011-12 there was no dedicated budget. There was no
you.
expenditure in respect of Vrede Dairy.
yeah, absolutely. I'm quite happy with that. In fact, you put that in your supplementary affidavit.
Yes.
Because really, Mohuma Mobung was a concept.
Yeah.
Vrede Dairy was hardly a concept. So
Yeah.
in 2011-2012, there would have been no,
Yeah.
not for that project anyway, for other projects, but not for that project. Yeah, so I'm happy enough with that. So we're talking 2012-2013, 12.5 million.
Yes.
I must say, please, I'm moving around a little bit simply because I've read your supplementary affidavit. So if you want us to do this in a more structured fashion, by going through that, I'm happy if you would prefer doing that because you actually set it out very nicely in that supplementary affidavit. Every year, what was allocated and what was spent. But I'm quite happy with just doing having a high-level discussion about these amounts. As the chairman has indicated, he's happy to drill down into the specifics at his leisure. Are you comfortable with continuing?
Yeah,
like
I'm
this?
fine with whichever direction you
I'm-
want to take.
Let's continue this way. So we are again looking at a high-level discussion about the amounts that were made available. I'm really focusing on this report because you have brought it to the attention of the chairman, ER 43, and the conclusions drawn at paragraph 20.1. I'm also pointing to the information that is contained in this particular letter. And maybe there is no finite answer to this because you are given information, different bits of information that don't really make sense when you look at it in its composite form, but you are reliant on the people who are giving you this information.
That's correct, Chair.
Is this really what you're
Yes.
saying? My only question then is oversight, Section 18 of the PFMA. Would one person, not necessarily the MEC or even the accounting officer, any official not sit down and say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense? You don't do that type of thing in Provincial Treasury.
Not at such an early stage at the start of a project. That would be not something we would be we would be doing. In addition to the fact that we don't necessarily have the capacity. If agriculture comes and tell you we've planted X number of hectares, we've bought this, bought that, this is where the money has gone. We don't have agricultural economists in Treasury who is able to take an informed decision. We ran into the same problem, for example, when we had the health crisis. We had a situation where our health officials were telling us, but National Department of Health has introduced a certain tablet that was 12 times more expensive than something that had been used. It's not a decision Treasury can pronounce itself on because we have no clue. We don't have the expertise, we don't have the capacity to say, use this pill, not that pill, because it's cheaper or not cheaper. It is too specialized for us to have an informed position on. We would then defer to say, National Department, there is provision in the PFMA to say, if there's an unfunded mandate, can you attend to it? In that specific case, we had asked for them to attend to it, and absolutely nothing happened subsequently. So it didn't matter whether we reported or not reported, there was no outcome. So those anomalies in government exists, like in, presume inherently to any other system, it will happen. I think it's important to note the way agriculture structured the agreement. It made provision for phases of the project, and money was going to be transferred X, Y, Z. No one ever came back to say, guys, let's take a step back. We are not comfortable with this, we are not comfortable with that. The accounting responsibility remained with the HOD ultimately.
Of the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development.
Of that department.
Yeah.
You can also say the legislature has a specific role to play when it comes to consideration of the annual performance plan. This is part of, it's linked to the budget. You table your annual performance plan before the budget vote speech is delivered. Now, consistently throughout the years, the State of the Province address spoke to the Vrede Dairy project.
As of 2013. As of 2012, actually.
I think it
Mohuma Mobung, you see?
Yeah.
Because it's really two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
Yes.
The budget vote speech of the department then goes into further details. Now, the APP the annual performance plan, is tabled before the budget vote speech. It gets referred to the legislature's committee on, in this case, it would have been agriculture and whatever other portfolios were linked into the legislature's committee. They consider the APP, they consider the budget speech, they report back to the House. Now, I have not gone into those reports at all. I am unable to say, how did the legislature look at the APPs? What was the recommendations? What was that oversight role? Because the oversight role cannot only be one entity or one party. The first line, monitoring and evaluation, should have come from agriculture and rural development itself. Treasury was looking at the funding. The way it was budgeted, it was also budgeted as transfer payments. And I think I dealt extensively in the affidavit on the accounting treatment of transfer payments.
And we're going to come back to that because the chairman has a particular interest in transfer payments.
Yes.
But let's leave transfer payments. I'm so sorry, Ms. Rockman.
I think you broke my train of thought there for a minute. Sorry.
I do apologize.
But okay, it was budgeted as transfer payments because at the time the accounting treatment was that a transfer payment becomes unrequited funds. It ceases to be public money. So you would have a limitation. There was no way Treasury would go to Estina, for example, and say, okay, explain to us how you use this money. The moment the transfer payment was effected, it was unrequited funds. And I think that is an important aspect that comes into it. Now, in the audit treatment, I think the audit section of my affidavit goes to details of the engagements we had with National Treasury and the National Accountant General. And the fact that it took us almost 2 years to get to a point to clarify, is this a transfer payment or should it be reclassified as goods and services? So it may have looked that, I don't know what people expected Treasury to do. We were not going to jump up and down and say, we are stopping this project right here. That was not going to happen. It doesn't work like that in government. But our behind-the-scenes role on trying to assist Auditor General and the Accountant General to get a sense of finality around how to deal with the accounting treatment was a critical part for us. Because had it been classified as goods and services, it brought the whole Vrede Dairy project and whatever was procured, it would have brought it back into the public sector. And we could then systematically start working through it. But as it stayed a transfer payment and it was unrequited funds, our role was cut off at that stage.
I really must say we are going to come back to this discussion. We must.
I was about to say it looks like you can't win to shift it to later because she seemed to deal with it, but I'm happy for us to deal with it later.
I think we should, Chairman, because it's a very interesting discussion, and Ms. Rockman is correct.
Yeah.
It took them from 2016 to 2018 to get a definitive directive from National Treasury.
Yeah, we can deal with it later.
Yes, and the impact was national. It wasn't just in relation to the Free State. So I think it's an important aspect that we will come back to later. In the meantime, I hear what you're saying about the limitations or the constraints on your oversight role, and I note those, and we'll move on so that we get to those transfer payments sooner rather than later.
Well, if you are moving away from
Not quite, Chairman, but you could please not.
Well, if you are still with the oversight role, you may proceed, but if you are moving away from it, I want to ask you some questions.
Chairman, if you don't mind, I just want to squeeze in one question.
Okay,
if that's all right with you.
Yes, that's fine.
And that really is just a reference to Ms. Elzabe Mchiza's evidence, because when they went, I think it would have been in June, July 2013, to go and inspect the farm. For one, there were no cattle there. They'd been taken to another farm. Did you find cattle on the farm when you were there?
Yes, on every occasion.
Each time? Oh, how many times did you go there?
It was May 2013, it was the first time.
Yes.
Then in 2014, I think it was 2014, I was at the Pumalela municipality with an engagement that on municipal financial management and audit outcomes. And Mr. Odwa Duda, who was the business executive for the AG in the Free State, was accompanying us together with Ms. Alice Miller. She was from the National AG's office. In that meeting, I suggested to the mayor to say, look, everyone is here. This is really like an elephant in the room. Let us just ask, do they want to see the farm or not? It turned out Mr. Duda had at that stage already visited the farm before. Ms. Miller had not been to the farm. So that was the second time, the second visit to the farm. I will find the date.
Do you want to go to page 56 of volume A of your original affidavit, paragraph 4.3.12. I don't know if that's the visit you're referring to.
Yes, thank you. That is correct, Chair.
There would also be at page 44 reference to the first visit, the 23rd of May visit, at page 44.
Yes. It was actually February 2015.
So that's the one on page 56
yes,
of volume A.
But at both occasions, there were cattle on the farm. I really cannot say how many cattle, what kind of cattle. There were cattle. They seem to be few. We were told other cattle are in the fields, are in wherever. But we saw cattle. I took photos of cattle. The numbers is obviously...
Give us a quick sense, 150, 10? This is a farm that
Those that you saw. Those
yeah,
that
that big
saw.
structure that I think there was photos at one stage in the commission. That whole structure was full from front to back. Cows were being fed.
So
What would be your estimate, 150? Oh, it's difficult to say.
I can show you the photos. You should
because
estimate
you were,
from that.
Because you were
Yeah.
MEC for finance, I nearly said you are a finance person, so you should know. But but that's not your background. You were just MEC for finance.
There was not 800 in that what we
Yeah.
saw.
yeah.
Definitely not.
500?
No, far less.
Far less.
Yes.
Yes. So that was the first observation Ms. Mchiza made. The other observation was they too found in June, July 2013 that very little progress had been made. They couldn't see where their 24 million had made a difference, which is one of the issues that informed their decision to withdraw, one of, not the only one of the ones that informed their decision to withdraw the CASP funding. I just wanted to put that in, Chairman, but you had wanted to deal with some of the oversight or related matters.
Could I comment just before?
Yes, please
Chair,
do.
Please. I think that's another example of the fragmented approach that government had. Because as Dove did that site visit, we did not have information on those details. For example, they said that there's a technical report. We never had sight of that technical report. So it made it very difficult. Now, we know National Treasury is now investigating something this side. Dove is busy doing site visits that side. No one is talking to us as Treasury at the time. So that fragmentation really didn't assist anyone. Mr. Jankelson is saying we didn't do anything, but realistically, what else do you want us to have done at that stage? Because exactly, National Treasury had already initiated an investigation. We can't initiate another investigation. Dove is doing site visits. They are stopping their funding. If we had stopped the funding at that stage, then what? Except for being technically right, what was going to happen to the animals on the farm? They were going to, what, die? It was not a solution. I think the focus at that stage was that everyone was trying to be right and no one was trying to find a solution to the problem. And I think that to me was something that we really had to take into account. The animals was there. They had to be fed, they had to be medicine, they had to be water, they had to be milked. Simply stopping funding does not make all these other problems disappear. I think it was November 2013, that a further submission came. It was either November 2013 or 14.
From?
From agriculture, because we had not made available funding in the adjustment budget. I think it was November 2013. We had not made funding available because the funding was simply not there. And yet afterwards, another submission did come from agriculture asking us to make funding available. And the HOD Treasury, it's that letter with the long notation, a handwritten notation, to say, though we agree that we will make this funding available, it does not mean that we agree to the purpose of the expenditure. We do not intend to undermine the National Treasury investigation, but he took into account the possible consequences of not acting. So it's much more complicated than just to say you should have stopped the funding. There were specific practical reasons. I think we should also point out that at no stage did anyone at a political level from national government raise the matter with me as MEC Finance. Not the Minister of Finance, not the Deputy Minister of Finance, no one, not the Minister, Deputy Minister Agriculture. It was not raised with us. And we had a practice in the Budget Council, which is like the MEC of the finance MECs. There was space where the Minister could raise specific issues directly with us. And issues that was raised at various times included, for example, our overcommitment on bursaries as the Free State. It included Makufe. So issues were raised. Vrede Dairy was never raised at that level. It would have been appropriate that at such a political level, if there was this substantial concern, the ministers would sit with premiers not only in the National Executive Committee of the ANC. They could have discussed it there. They could have discussed it in the President's Coordinating Council. They could have discussed it in any other number of intergovernmental forums. It was, to my knowledge, never discussed. no one raised it with us directly. So I think that it also illustrates that it was not as easy as Mr. Jankelson may make it out to be.
Can I say?
Well, let's go back to the limitations on oversight. I thought that it's part of the obligations that National Treasury has, and I would imagine that what National Treasury is obliged to do at national level is the same thing that Provincial Treasury is obliged to do at provincial level. I thought that one of the obligations of National Treasury is to look after how different departments are spending taxpayers' money, and to take measures, certain measures, when they realize that a particular department might not be spending taxpayers' money in the right way. I know that I'm putting that at a very general level. Am I mistaken in that understanding? I'm talking about national, but I'm talking about National Treasury on the basis that whatever national is supposed to do at national level, Provincial Treasury is supposed to do at provincial level. But you would be more informed and might be able to tell me that some of the obligations are the same, but others are not. They apply to both, but some don't apply to both.
Chair, the basic workings would be the same. We have, for example, what we call the July-August visits of National Treasury, but it happens at a technical level. All departments, or at least the high-spending departments, your education, your health, your police, roads, transport, the bigger departments, there would be engagements. It would also serve as benchmarking exercises for us. It would flag certain issues where there would be concerns, underspending, overspending, overcommitments, various issues. Then importantly, we would have the provincial medium-term expenditure hearings. That is sort of an assessment of where we are halfway through the financial year. It forms almost the foundation for your consideration of the adjustment appropriation bill as we begin to put it together. But it also informs priorities for the budget for the forthcoming financial year. So literally, departments are required to report extensively on what was in their APPs, what have they done up to a certain point of the financial year, about halfway through the financial year. Are funds committed? Are funds likely to be underspent? It enables us also to see where funds are clearly not going to be spent. We would know, okay, we are going to take money from XYZ and reallocate to address pressures wherever else. So that process does happen and did happen consistently, yes.
So in terms of payments, when Provincial Treasury is supposed to either make payments or authorize payments, this might not be literally, technically correct, but when it is supposed to do that in regard to the projects of any particular department, is it not obliged to check whether, for example, certain, or rather procurement procedures have been followed, even though the accounting officer of the department is there to see to that? Aren't they entitled to say, if you are asking for us to authorize this funding, you need to satisfy us that you are going to spend it properly, and properly includes where you are supposed to follow procurement procedures satisfy us that you have followed them. Because if we are not satisfied that you want money to spend on a project where you have satisfied or complied with procurement procedures, we won't authorize. You have to, if you think you were justified not to follow procurement procedures for this project because you believe there should be deviation, satisfy us that this is a deviation case. Isn't that the position? Because we won't be party in that way to you spending money in breach of the PFMA, and the PFMA, as I understand the position, being basically National Treasury legislation. Therefore, you would be the guardians of that piece of legislation.
Thanks, Chair. The Provincial Treasury pays its own service providers. Departments request cash on a monthly basis. They give us cash projections. You have 120 Rand for the year, so every month you get 10. If you project by December, your spending is going to slow down, you will ask for maybe 3, and in January you'll ask for 7. Then every month we give you the cash, what you ask for. Your disbursement of the money we allocate on a monthly basis is between you, your procurement processes, and your service providers. That is why the irregularity of expenditure that occurs happens at the point where the expenditure is incurred, where the procurement takes place, and then in this case of agriculture where expenditure is incurred. So we do not have sight on the details of invoices. What comes to us is cash projections, cash requisition. We need so much money. This is in line with whatever the department would have projected for the year. We would check, do you still have money? Have you overspent? Do we have cash available? And then we would disburse. If a department suddenly wants 2 or 3 times the amount that we would have anticipated, there would have to be a motivation to say, why would we need this money? Because it's cash management. We have to protect resources also. We are trying to make a little extra money with bank interests and so forth. It would also be influenced by, for example, conditional grants, the relevant transferring department. We would only release conditional grant funding if we had received it from the relevant national department. So the details of expenditure would lie with the Department of Agriculture in this case. Those details would not be submitted to us. We would not have sight of invoices or that type of procurement details.
Excuse me. Of course, I had evidence some time back in relation to this matter that National Treasury initiated an investigation. And we also know that National Treasury issues instructions? I don't know, I can't remember the full term, but basically giving guidance as to, even with procurement, as to what will be accepted as compliance and what will not be accepted as compliance. So National Treasury seems to play a very important role with regard to procurement and the compliance with procurement procedures, at least at national level. Is that right?
Yes, as National Treasury would issue either instruction notes or it would issue practice notes or Treasury regulations.
Yes.
At a provincial context, we contextualize.
Yes.
And then also subsequently issue a provincial
instruction
note to say this is how this Treasury regulation in the provincial context has this, and this implications.
Yes.
On cost containment measures, for example, the same.
Yes.
You would not apply it equally across the country because of different dynamics. So we customize that into what is workable for us. And we would issue similarly such cost containment or relevant practice notes. But the responsibility would remain that of the accounting officer. And in this case, once the accounting officer had signed the deviation, he approved the deviation, and stood by that deviation. I think we had a long conversation and engagement with the AG on at which stage can this deviation be set aside. If the accounting officer stands by his decision to deviate, someone will have to approach court to set it aside. Who is that someone in this case?
Well, we'll talk about that in due course, because I found that part of the discussion quite interesting. But you have said that the Provincial Treasury would issue the equivalent of provincial instruction notes.
Yes.
But who enforces them? Is it not the Provincial Treasury? You issue them to say departments must do ABCD or mustn't do ABCD. Is it not the Provincial Treasury who has the obligation to enforce those?
In our key control matrix reports, somewhere in the affidavit, in the supplementary affidavit, we outline all of those areas. That it's also a monitoring tool to see what is our compliance of departments with relevant prescripts and so forth. Those same instruction notes, practice notes, etc., would also be provided to the Office of the Auditor General. So in the audit, part of the audit would include the compliance with all relevant regulations, instruction notes, practice notes, etc., that would have been issued. Then you would also have the CFO forum that was chaired by the Provincial Accountant General. They would report against these issues. And it would depend on the accuracy of their reports, on the extent to which we were able to monitor compliance or non-compliance.
But you refer to monitoring compliance. That must be supervision, that must be enforcement. Or why would you monitor if you are not the enforcer? What's the purpose of monitoring?
You would be able to say, Department X, you have not addressed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes.
But you cannot, we did not have the ability.
The power to issue a sanction.
Yeah, to issue a sanction.
Yes. But you would, part of the Provincial Treasury's obligation was to monitor whether, in this case, the Department of Agriculture complied with PFMA procedures, including whatever provincial instruction notes may have been issued, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, Chair.
Now, did it monitor that?
To the extent it was able to, yes, I think we did.
Yes. Why do you say to the extent? Why is there anything that prevented you from, when I say you, I mean the Provincial Treasury, was there anything that prevented the Provincial Treasury from monitoring the full extent of compliance or non-compliance? Was there anything which it could not, were there any corners it could not go to check whether there had been proper compliance?
In terms of all this, the standard procedures that any department would expect to be followed, I think all of that was followed. In the case of Estina specifically, the deviation, there was no recovery from the deviation.
I'm sorry, just repeat, there was no?
There was no way to recover from the fact that the accounting officer concluded the contract based on the deviation. There was no procurement process followed. No other procurement process followed. We could not redo a procurement process. The contract was signed. Mr. Tabeti was adamant he stood by the deviation, that he had the power to approve the deviation.
Okay, no, I understand that. I just want us to get there at the right time. So, but in terms of, as a response to my question, you accept that whatever it is you would have wanted to see in order to effectively perform your monitoring obligations, you would have been able to see if you wanted to see it.
Yes,
Nobody
we were not prevented from going
Yes,
to
you
the
were
farm.
not. Yes, yes.
There was coordination. If
Yes.
someone wanted to go to the farm, they could.
Yes.
No one was prevented or
Yes.
instructed to say, no, you can't go to the farm.
Yes, okay.
That
Yes.
that was never a problem.
Okay, so, is the position that you are saying what you did pick up as part of monitoring, maybe not necessarily as part of monitoring, but what you did pick up as a matter of fact, is that there was deviation. Did you consider, and I would imagine you would have, when I say you again, I'm Provincial Treasury, maybe you in particular, I'm not sure. Did you consider whether this was a case where deviation was justified? Because I'm taking it that if you have an obligation to monitor, you must have the obligation to satisfy yourself whether things have been done properly, because otherwise there is no point in monitoring if you are not expected to form a view whether things have been done properly.
Chair, yes, then I must refer back to, I'm able to reconstruct how the MEC at the time and the HOD at the time applied their minds to it
Yes,
from
yes.
the available
Yes,
documentation.
Yes, yes.
I think in other evidence before the Commission, it came out that the Provincial Accountant General had advised that this is going to be a problem. And the whole process that was then agreed upon, arising from that Treasury Committee meeting, to say, ultimately, this is what is going to have to happen before the HOD Treasury at the time and the MEC Finance at the time signed off on the request of Agriculture. If you remember, they said part of it was that the contract must be reviewed, there must be further discussions on securing the funding, etc. So at that time, I'm not aware whether there were other engagements between Treasury and Agriculture or anyone else in the environment. I only know what I knew as DG at the time attending that specific Treasury Committee meeting. And what was clear there was that Treasury at the time was not in possession of all the relevant documentation. And part of what I had to do was to make sure that Agriculture provide Treasury with the documentation. Based on what they had, they could not sign off. And there was that process of engagement and going through documentation, consultation with the state law advisors and so forth, that then led to them, the HOD Treasury at the time and the MEC at the time, they both signed off on certain conditions.
Well, you, like Mr. Bashir, you must also remind me when I put you into matters where you were not MEC for Finance, but at the time that you became MEC for Finance and you became involved with this, where was this whole project at that time? I'm now trying to see what it is you may have had an obligation to check and what you might not have had an obligation to check.
Well,
in terms of monitoring, or the people under you.
The approval was June 2012?
June 2012.
Yes, the EXCO approval, and then, yeah, it was when I was still DG.
Yes.
I became MEC March 2013.
Yes, yes.
The first funding had been paid before I had started.
Yes.
And then after I had started, the funding was still made available.
Continuing.
Yes.
Yes. But do you remember whether when you became MEC for Finance,
yes,
the problem about deviation had been picked up by the Provincial Treasury or not?
Yes, it was already in June 2012.
It
Yes.
had already been
Yes.
picked up.
It was picked up at the time that the request was made for the first funding of
Yes.
the 30 million.
Yes, yes. And I guess that you are not in a position to justify or not justify how it was dealt with before you became MEC for Finance? Or are you able to,
From what?
in terms of monitoring and what was done pursuant to monitoring?
From what is clear to me is that the Provincial Accountant General at the time, Mrs. Fourie, did advise that this is going to be a problem. It's likely to constitute irregular expenditure. The MEC and the HOD at the time acknowledged, I think, that shortcoming in the procurement process, but in mitigation, agreed that whatever contract that was signed before this matter went to EXCO, that contract had to be redrafted, that further funding solutions had to be provided or had to be considered, etc., etc.
Okay, all right. So, but I think what we have established is that at least provincial treasury has an obligation to monitor, and that includes procurement issues, even though the accounting office of each department remains responsible for that.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Chairman, I would like actually to go back to your visit. I know you've gone way beyond that, but just to tidy that up, because you were there in May of 2013. It's really relevant to what the chairman's been asking you about your oversight role. And as you were speaking, the comment I wrote down here that I want to pursue, in the context of your saying there was very little that you could do because different investigating arms of government, whether it was DAF or whether it was National Treasury, whether it was the department itself, were not talking to one another. They certainly weren't talking to Provincial Treasury. The topic is still oversight, the oversight role of Provincial Treasury. And as you were responding, the thought that went through my mind was, your difficulty really, or certainly my difficulty with your answer is, by going there on a site visit, you placed yourselves as the Provincial Treasury squarely in the cauldron of the debate around what that 85 million may or may not have done for the project, because you actually went there and you made certain observations. You could have gone back to the department, for instance, and engaged with them further, because you were aware that they do get monthly reports and quarterly reports. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Those
Yes.
are must.
Yes.
Those are part of what they have to get. And I was just looking at, in fact, my colleague just brought to my attention a quarterly report that we have been dealing with Mr. Tabete. And it's ER 106.1. I'm at page 1270. That's C, volume C. 1270. Really, and I'm interrogating what you're saying about your role, your oversight role. 1270, and it's ER 106.1. This is a quarterly progress report dated December 2012. And I concede this would have gone to the department, not to yourselves. But this is information prepared by Estina, not by the department, that was then filed with the department. And if we go over the page to point number 5, as at December 2012, this is what Estina says. It's at page 1271, paragraph 5, titled Cow Purchase. They say, and I quote, "We are planning to make the purchase of cows by the end of March 2013. For that, we have visited more than 9 dairy farms and identified about 1,600 pregnant heifer cows. Their cost varies from 7,000 rand to 18,000 rand per animal, depending on their pregnant status and genetics. We are quite careful in selecting the animals for their production potential, health, other condition, and age of the animals. Now we are going to start the negotiations for the purchase of cows. Meantime, we have also contacted some insurance companies to insure the cows before their transportation. If everything goes well, cows will be purchased during March 2013, close quote." Then over the page, at page 1272, right at the bottom at Roman 5, they talk about setting up a cattle feed plant. And then over the page again, at page 1273, Roman 6, purchase of cows, they say in their report, I quote, "Keeping all the facts in mind, the Estina will try to purchase at least 300 cows by the end of March 2013. The rest of the report really speaks to what they say were limitations in getting this project going. But if you were there in May, March, April, May, 23rd of May, let's say 2 months later, I would like to understand from this report that they would have purchased no more than about 300 cows. Just from what they're saying here in this report. Does that make sense to you? Because you speak of the number of cows that you observed on the property.
That number of cows was when I was with Mr. Duda and Ms. Miller.
That would have been in
2015.
February 2015.
Yeah. At this first visit, there was not that number of cows at the farm. There were some cows, but not the number of cows that was there in 2015.
So you would estimate that when you were there in 2013, in May, having now paid the entire 114 million, roughly how many cows were there?
They were not in one place, so you couldn't see all of them at the same time. We were taken to where the calves were. Others were in this veld, that veld. They were not in one place, so you couldn't get a picture to say, okay, the first X number of cows looks like they've arrived and they are here. But as you indicate also, Chair, this is the report between Estina and Agriculture. This would not be the level of details that Treasury would necessarily have insight to.
That's really the theme of your answer, as I've understood it, that at a certain level of detail, the Provincial Treasury would not get involved. But you expect to be informed of any hiccups, of any difficulties that arise by the accounting officer. So the Commission should really continue to look to the accounting officer for answers to various issues that are raised by witnesses who've been to these proceedings.
Yes, simply because we would not be involved to that detailed level of operations on a daily basis.
Yes. I'm moving on, Chairman, if you have no other questions on this.
Let's just, the visit to the farm. I think Mr. Bashe is probably right that it demonstrates something. And one, I guess it demonstrates that you, as Provincial MEC for Finance, as Provincial Treasury, you regard it as your obligation to at least go and have a look whether certain things are in place. And you probably would agree with me that even though you might not be have been expected to deal with certain details, but there would be certain ballparks so that if certain things were not in place, you would say, hang on, what's going on here? Is that right? Am I
Yes,
right?
that's correct, Chair.
Yeah. So there have to be certain features that you have to look for. If they are in place, then maybe you are not expected to go into finer details. But if one or more is not in place, that's supposed to be a red flag for you to say, come on, Department of Agriculture, tell us more. We are not happy. That far we agree.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I would think that if you had, as Provincial Treasury, had an obligation to monitor, that it can't be right that the Commission should only look to the accounting officer for the Department of Agriculture for answers. I would think that what would be correct is that in regard to certain things, the Commission is entitled to look for answers both to the accounting officer of the department as well as Provincial Treasury. But with regard to some things, that may be only the accounting officer of the department. Because at a certain level, you have said finer details, maybe not, but that means at a certain level, you share certain obligations. Maybe you don't share, but you were, as the Provincial Treasury, the supervisor or the one who monitors whether there is proper performance. Maybe supervisor is not the correct term, but you are supposed to keep an eye whether things seem to be in order in terms of performance. And if you see red flags, you are supposed to intervene. Is that right?
To a certain extent, yes, Chair.
Yes. It just depends what things would be red flags or what things you are supposed to look for.
Yes, in as far as controlling revenue and expenditure, that they did not spend more than what was allocated, that indeed that there was never a question that what was outside the budget would be supplemented.
Yes.
I think we deal in detail in the affidavit and the supplementary affidavit on the way agriculture was also impacted when they received money and when money was taken away from the department. Like I said, also in the provincial medium-term expenditure hearings, the PMTEC hearings, the department had to report in detail. They had to meet the monthly reporting requirements, the key control matrix reports. Those reports were also sent to the relevant MECs of all departments, not only agriculture, but Premier and all MECs received their reports. Attention was drawn to certain areas that needed to be improved on. I know in 2013-14, after the audit, we did the analysis. We said per department, this was your main issues in your audit. You need to know that you need to address this, otherwise it's going to impact your next audit. So all of those things were done in terms of the broader monitoring. We simply didn't have the capacity to monitor project implementation at the level of the details of specific projects. Also in the environment at the time, Vrede Dairy is not a particularly big project. It might sound big in the sense of 250 million, 500 million, whatever, how many millions it was. But in comparison to other budgets, when we had to intervene in the Department of Health, we were looking at accruals of between 700 million and 1.2 billion. Then obviously your focus shifts to where the bigger problem is and the cows in Vrede had to look after themselves for a while, whilst we were busy dealing with health. The following year, education, we had to intervene. So we had two provincial departments, health and education, then under administration of Treasury. So the environment was very complicated and took up quite a significant period of time that would not have enabled us to pay detailed, minute attention to a relatively, let me say, small project implemented by one Department of Agriculture when we had the big eaters like education and health that had specific problems that had to be dealt with. So the capacity basically of our practical oversight or monitoring, that capacity just isn't there.
Well, we'll come back to it when we talk about the deviation and the implementing agents and so on. I don't know whether you were going to go there already or you still have some other topic.
Chairman, with your leave, I'd actually just like Ms. Rockman to look at her supplementary affidavit.
Yes.
And just at least enlighten the Commission on the funding sources. Ms. Anna Vrede did tell the Commission that all funds must be paid into the Provincial Revenue Fund. You're looking for the 13HH, Exhibit HH 13.1. It's a smallish file, so it's 13.1, it's fairly small. Supplementary affidavit, so the new one you sent in day before yesterday. Is that marked 13.1, to
No, it's 13.
I think the big file on to your left is on top of your supplementary affidavit.
It's the smallest of the large files.
That looks like the right file. You're going to take us through that material. Can I just continue to say that, of course, Ms. Vrede did give us a sense of the sources of funding. And she pointed out at the time that Section 21 to 25 of the PFMA, which give effect to Sections 2 to 6 and 2 to 7 of the Constitution, regulate provincial revenue funds. That is correct.
Yes.
Briefly, using your supplementary affidavit, take the chairman through these funding sources just so that he has a clear picture as to where money comes from for this province.
Well, for this province and any other province, Jay.
Feel free to do it quickly because I have read it and yeah.
It's equitable share, which every branch of government has a share of national revenue, and then it splits between the national, provincial, and local government sphere as well. That's equitable share. It's unconditional funding. It doesn't come with certain conditions. From the equitable share, in the Free State, the practice was developed that a percentage of equitable share was used for infrastructure enhancement allocation. That's almost like a provincial conditional grant. It also gets published, it gets gazetted after the Appropriation Act gets passed and assented to. You publish your allocations to hospitals, to schools, to municipalities, and to departments. Now, the infrastructure enhancement allocation is meant like co-funding to where a national department allocates conditional grant funding, but it's essentially to accelerate infrastructure development. Then you would have your provincial own revenue. That is basically our traffic fines, money that we get from gambling licenses and so forth. And then the next major source would be the conditional grants, which comes with specific conditions from specific national transferring departments.
Can I ask you a question in relation to those conditional grants? Is there responsibility on the provincial treasury that dispenses these grants to monitor how they are utilized?
No.
Does that responsibility lie exclusively with DAF, with the national office?
It's between the National Transferring Department and the Provincial Receiving Department.
doesn't that open those conditional grants to abuse in the sense of shifting money from a conditional grant to an area that the condition does not cover?
Strictly speaking, Chairperson, that cannot happen. You cannot
You
use
can't shift it.
No, you can't shift it. You can't use conditional grant money for
For
any other
anything other
purpose,
than-
because that would then lead to almost immediate withholding of further funds. And in the case of local government, we know we've seen MEC money, for example, utilized for operations. National Treasury immediately recovers that money. So it should not happen.
Well, this is what I want to interrogate. Strictly speaking, it should not happen. I hear what you're saying. In practice, does it happen?
I would be hesitant to say it happens at provincial government level. I would concede that it happens at local government level far more often.
Okay, let's move on from that, simply because I'm trying to rush through the next section.
I wanted to say the answer you gave to Mr. Washer's question about whether the provincial treasurer would have a responsibility to monitor whether conditional grants are used by provincial departments for the purposes for which they were given. You said that that responsibility is between the national department and I think the department concerned. I think you said, yeah.
Yes, more or less, Chair.
Do you mean that your monitoring obligation doesn't cover that?
Not in any particular detail. For example, we are not a party to the process where provincial departments bid for conditional grant funding. We don't have insight into what projects get presented. In the case of agriculture, for example, they had a national assessment panel. Whatever projects get approved and not approved, the agreement is between that department and the provincial department. There's no role that, unless a department would ask, provincial treasury must do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The reporting, for example, reporting would go directly to the national department. They might, as a courtesy, send us a copy. But it's not limited to agriculture. Human settlements, for example, we have no insight into the human settlement system.
So would the explanation for that be because the money doesn't come from provincial treasury?
Yes, I think mostly...
That would be the explanation?
Yes.
So because that money doesn't come from you, therefore you don't have a responsibility of monitoring, because the person or department that grants the money is the one that has the responsibility to make sure that the money is used for the right purpose.
Yes, the Division of Revenue Act annually would set out in details the conditions for such conditional grants, and it may assign certain responsibilities to Treasury as well. But our execution of that would be limited by the information, obviously, we have access to.
Okay.
Yes, but without belaboring the point, just to make it clear, conditional grant funds are processed through the provincial treasury. In that, those monies are transferred into the provincial revenue fund, and then provincial treasury dispenses those funds to the departments that those funds are supposed to go to.
That's correct, Chair.
Yeah.
In that way, does the provincial treasury act as an agent of the national department, or do you know whether it simply acts in its own right? You might not know.
That would be an interesting question. No,
you don't know. But
the provision is just that all funding have to be paid into the revenue fund.
Yes.
The departments give us their cash projections, and we pass on the money.
You might just be a conduit.
We are
pipe.
basically a conduit
Yeah, okay. all right.
for the funding.
Okay.
But you are also the parties responsible for ensuring that the supply chain management policies and procedures are complied with by various departments.
Well, each department, each accounting officer must execute his responsibilities or her responsibilities as accounting officer in respect of supply chain management. But then, yes, as from financial governance perspective of that unit of Treasury, they would exercise oversight over that compliance.
Yes.
So just to make sure I understand your answer to that question, to the extent that conditional grants or the expenditure of conditional grants is supposed to be subject to PFMA procedures, you still have the responsibility of monitoring that PFMA procedures are complied with by the provincial department that receives conditional grants. That part remains yours. You are not involved in whether they should be granted these conditional grants or not, but if they are going to do anything that falls within the mandate of the provincial government, it's your responsibility to monitor whether they comply with PFMA procedures.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
We have agreed that in the 2011-2012 financial year, while you were in the Premier's office, there was no allocation for Mohuma Mobung or for Vrede made by the relevant department.
Yes,
Yeah.
Chair. Yeah.
We then looked at 2012-2013, and we've agreed that in that year, 12.5 million was made available. For Vrede.
So let me just find the...
Well, if you tell her what you're looking for, she might assist you.
Maybe if you go to page 5 to 6 deals with 2011-2012. Then that is followed by 2012-2013. Let me help you. 2012-2013 starts on page 6.
Yes.
And I suppose the question that I'm asking relates to what you might have picked up, that there's the 12.5 million that was allocated to the Vrede Dairy project, but in the same financial year, a total of 30 million was allocated to Mohuma Mobung. Would that be correct? 2012-2013.
If you can give me the paragraph you are making reference to.
So we are on, let me just pick this up. We are on page 6, and it's Roman 4, where you say additional funding from provincial owned revenue adjustment amounting to 14.045 million for the implementation of Mohuma Mobung Development Program. Roman 5, additional funding from provincial revenue reserves amounting to 15.955 million for the implementation of Mohuma Mobung Development Program. Page 006, paginated 6, page 6, Chairman. I should stop saying 00. Paginated
Yes,
page
you.
6.
Yes, that,
So when we total those two amounts, Mohuma Mobung would have received 30 million.
Yes, in the 2011-12 adjustment budget.
Let's just say that again. In the 2011-2012 adjustment budget,
If you go to paragraph F on
yes,
page
indeed,
5.
I'm there.
Yeah.
But that means that it would then be used in which financial year?
In the 11-12 financial year.
In the 11-12
Yes,
financial year.
The year ending 31st March 2012. So Mohuma Mobung was not just Vrede Dairy.
Correct.
It was a lot of other initiatives was part of it. So this indicates additional funding where it came from. For example, they received additional funding for disaster management grant for of 4.736. It's that improvement in condition of service of 1.5. There's 300,000 relating to veld fires. It was a rollover of 3.4 from the previous year for CASP funding, but then also a decrease in current payments of 49.344 million.
Yes.
So it just sets out all the different changes in the 11-12 financial year.
Yes. Can you do this for me, please, Ms. Rockman? Can you keep that page open, but can you also pick up your original affidavit? And can you go to page 16 and 17 of that? Are you there?
Yes. I
Right.
think so.
So your reference on page 16 under the Mohuma Mobung framework. And I'm assuming that we are here dealing with budget allocations, as you say, in 2.2.2 for the 2012-2013 financial year. You make reference to Annexure ER6. Please go to Annexure ER6. It's in the same document. You'll find it at page 231. And keep your finger on that page 16. I just want you to explain this to us. Here you say at page 16, the Executive Council discussed the proposed budgets of the following departments and agreed to the summarized issues relating to these departments. Over the page, 3.1, Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. D, provide more details and plans for dairy parlor and processing facility in Vrede at the cost of 13 million, I presume that should be. Are you with me as far as that is concerned?
I think you lost me several minutes ago.
Don't worry. I'm bringing you right back to page 17 of your original affidavit. You made me read all these papers, Ms. Rockman. You sent this supplementary through on Monday. I read it. So let's have a look at, and it's the useful document, quite frankly. I'm glad that you did give it to us, because it elaborates on some of the issues you raised in your original affidavit. So don't think that it's not been of any use. It has really been of use. And I'm sure the chairman will find quite a lot of value just from having that to supplement what you had written in the original document. So page 17 of the original document.
Yes.
Then you move, keep your finger there, you move to ER6 because you here refer to ER6. ER6 is on page 231.
Okay.
You're at ER6.
Yeah.
If you have a look at ER6, for one, These are minutes dated the 13th of June 2012.
ER6.
ER6.
I have it as the record of cabinet decision.
Yes. And then it says cabinet minute number. It doesn't have
okay.
a minute number.
Yes.
You're correct. You read the right
Yes.
document. So for one, the date is not the same date you mentioned in your paragraph 2.2.2, unless I'm misreading this. That's the first issue. The second, more material issue, is I'm really trying to locate that 13 million that you say is at paragraph 3.1 of ER6. There is no 3.1. 3.1D. There is no 3.1D at ER6.
Chair, the paragraph 222 refers to the EXCO meeting 29 February 2012, not to June 2012.
So 222 refers to an EXCO meeting.
Yeah, during its deliberations on the proposed budget allocations for 2012-13
Yeah.
on 29 February 2012. I think we might have referred to the wrong annexure here.
Well, 222 refers to annexure ER5, not ER6, isn't it?
Chair, 5 is a completely different document. It's a presentation, September 2011 on the Mohuma Mobung strategy.
Excuse me, but what I'm saying is the position that there is a reference to a wrong annexure then?
Yes, probably, but
Yeah.
I think that the issue I'd like to think I can still raise the issue with you, Ms. Rockman, because you worked with these documents and you're familiar with them. My real interest is in that 13 million under 3.1D. I'm assuming that minute exists. I have no difficulty with that. And here you say that the dairy, parlor, and processing facility were going to be put up at a cost of 13 million rand.
Yes, that's correct.
That's correct.
Yes.
Good. That minute is February 2012 minute,
Yes.
would be. And my question really is, if the Vrede facility was going to cost 13 million, I'm assuming it's the same, it's working off the 12.5 million we talked about earlier on that had been budgeted for.
Yes, that's
Because
correct.
it's the closest to that.
Yes.
But the entire Mohuma Mobung budget for 2012-13 was 30 million.
Yes, I think that's correct.
This 12.5,
I'm sorry, just make sure that you speak loud enough that
Okay.
your answers will be recorded. Thank you.
this 12.5, is it part of the 30 million that was allocated to Mohuma Mobung? Because after all, Vrede falls within the basket of Mohuma Mobung projects.
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
It would.
Yes.
When did this 13 million balloon into the royal sum of about 572 million, if you take all those 114 millions over 3 years? I'm really just paraphrasing. I understand that the facility was going to cost 13 million in February 2012. But as of June 2012, it would appear Mr. Tabete thought it was going to cost the department 114 million per annum over 3 years, or per financial year over 3 years. I don't know if you have insights into this.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I think I also raised it in the supplementary affidavit, that there was a further presentation during April where the amount of 13 million was confirmed of Vrede Dairy, because initially we thought it was a typing error. But unless it was a consistent typing error throughout a period of time, it seemed the cost was 13 million. But I am not aware how from the February presentation, the March presentation, or the April presentation, how it grew from the 13 million to the big mega project presented at EXCO in June 2012, which needed additional funding of at least 84 million for the first year, and then the overall funding. I have no insight into how and where that quantum changed and what motivated it.
Fair enough. You have no idea.
No, I don't.
Much as you made inquiries, nobody's been able to explain it to you.
Yes, there's no records in Treasury that says there was engagements, it was motivated this way, that way. It is entirely possible that this matter was discussed in the economic cluster, and I did not attend that cluster meetings. It's possible, but I have not gone into those kinds of records of. Mr. Dabeti probably presented also in this clusters. They did a number of presentations, but that it speaks to elevating the project from a relatively small project under Moama Mabung to the scope that was presented in June 2012, there I have no insight to share.
But
would it be correct to say Provincial Treasury would have been expected to keep an eye on such things? Any project within the provincial government, any department within provincial government, that they would have to keep an eye if a project was initially said to require a certain amount, and then at a certain stage it, as Mr. Bashe puts, balloons into a much bigger amount.
Yes, I'm sure, Chair, that this would have taken Treasury by surprise almost.
And they would have asked questions. At least you would expect them to have done so.
Yes, well, it happened after the fact, but
yes.
Certainly in the annual performance plan, the project was taken up at an affordable level of 13 million. It stayed 13 million. When the submission came to EXCO, it did not have. There was previously, it was standard procedure that EXCO memos with financial implications should go to Treasury first for comment and have their comments already included before it comes to EXCO. In this case, this was not done. So I think Treasury would have been taken by surprise that there's now suddenly a project 3 months after the start of the financial year that is at a much higher, that needs much more funding than what was allocated. So I think it would have been obviously a matter of concern.
Can I ask, was that a directive that projects with financial implications must go via Treasury, Provincial Treasury, before they are placed before EXCO?
Chair, yes, EXCO memorandums. It was my understanding by the time I joined government that it even came from the previous term, that it was standard operating procedure that a memo does not go to EXCO without it passing through a cluster, and if it has financial implications that are not accommodated in the budget, it would go to Treasury to enable Treasury to comment, to say we have funding, we don't have funding, this may be possible, this may not be possible.
So this is yet another directive that the HOD of the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development did not comply with.
Well, he was not an HOD in the previous term of government that ended 2009, but it would have been, I think, a standard procedure, but it was often not followed.
No, maybe I should rephrase the question. Was that particular directive operative in the 2011-2012 financial year?
It would have been.
Good. So if it was operative and he was employed as of August 2011, he would have been able to familiarize himself with this particular directive.
Yes. I think
Certainly
so.
his CFO, Ms. Dlamini, would have known about it as the CFO.
Senior management in government should have known about it.
So
and,
again,
and
sorry.
certainly an accounting officer of a department.
Yes, it would make sense, Chair, in the
Yeah.
sense of you would not want to take your colleagues by surprise in an EXCO meeting to say, I'm coming with this project, whether or not there's funding or there is funding. You would consult before you go to EXCO. So I'm just not able to comment on whether there was that kind of engagement, but certainly the EXCO memo that went in June 2012 is silent on that kind of engagement.
So what you are really saying is EXCO itself ought to have inquired in the debate whether that particular memo that committed the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development to this huge sum of money had gone via the Provincial Treasury. It ought to have been debated at EXCO on the 13th of June 2012.
It should have been noticed at the very least that it did not contain the comments of Provincial Treasury, or for that matter, I think the comments of the state law advisors, because the standard EXCO memo format provides for legal implications to be set out.
So what we have here as at the 5th of June 2012 is there's this directive that prima facie was not complied with by the HOD, Agriculture and Rural Development. 2, Section 38(2) of the PFMA says you do not commit a department to a liability unless you've made provision for it. No provision had been made for this particular project at that point in time. Can I rephrase that? Inadequate provision had been made because 30 million was sitting there under Mohuma Mobung. But inadequate provision had been made when you look at the 114 million that government was now committed to pay to Estina. Am I correct?
Chair, I think you are correct, except to say that when the HOD Treasury and the MEC Treasury then ultimately signed off, that fulfilled the requirements of committing the revenue fund.
But they signed off on
After
the
the fact.
5th of July 2012 agreement because the 5th of June 2012 agreement was found to be invalid.
Yes, that's correct.
And you are saying that the 30 million that was then allocated to the Estina project or the Vrede Dairy project would have come from the Provincial Equitable Fund.
Yes.
I think that's what
Yes,
you say
yes.
in your statement.
Well, Ms. Kobashe, we are at 9 minutes, 10 minutes past 4. And let's talk about the way forward.
Yes, Chair.
How, at this stage, how much more time do you think is necessary in terms of hours before we finish?
Chairman, I would like
Before
to
you
think
finish with her?
I'd like to think we'll be done by lunchtime tomorrow. If you will permit us to run until 4:30 today, unless it's not convenient. The reason I ask, Chairman, is
Yeah.
I think I want to squeeze into this area of inquiry.
Yeah.
Just the question whether the 104 million, we know it was not properly budgeted for in the first year that it was supposed to be paid. And all I really want to know, without going into the detailed budgeting process, is whether it was then properly budgeted for, and if so, where, if we just have a clear indication as to what. That really is the essence of this area, Chairman. We can
Yes.
deal with it in the morning, of course.
Yes, we can, maybe we can go up to 4:30, or if we take a break now, then go up to 4:45. fine.
My feet are killing me, Chairman, so 4:30, I think, is about as long as they're going to keep me standing. But I'm also trying to cut out some of the other questions which I know really are not
Yes.
contentious or
Yes.
don't cover contentious material.
No, that's fine. It's just that if we continue, I think we should just take a short break. And I'm thinking if you need 20 minutes, if we take a short break, we must compensate for that. But if you say whether we take a break or not, let's stop at 4:30, we will, because I understand your situation. So maybe let's take a break now for 5 minutes, and then. But sometimes I say 5 minutes, and 5 minutes is not adequate when we are supposed to start. So shall we say 20 past? We resume at 20 past. It's now about 11 minutes past.
Yes, Chairman, that's
And then we can take it from there, how far we go, whether 5:30 or 25 to.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Chairman.
Okay. Well, Ms. Rockman, we normally finish at 4, but would like to continue. Is that fine with
Yes,
you?
it's fine.
And I think it's fine with your counsel as well.
We have no difficulty, Chair.
Thank you. We'll adjourn and resume at 20 past. We adjourn.
All rise.
Yeah, my eyes are burning. Yeah.
Are you okay? Bathroom or fine?
No, you just need it.
This is Brett's note. I'm sure you feel the same. Already curated to Is it?
Okay, let's continue. Are you going to prefer past or a little?
Just a little beyond, Chairman. It's just a section
Yeah.
that I'm trying to concertina
Okay.
and just deal with, so that tomorrow we just deal with one or two areas and we finish early-ish.
Okay, all
Thank you,
right.
Chairman. Ms. Rockman, the section I'm dealing with now really speaks to the budgeting process, I suppose. But the relevance for this inquiry is back to section 38.2 of the PFMA, whether in the 2012-2013, 2013-2014, 2014-2015 financial years, I'll just stop there for current purposes, provision was made for the Vrede Dairy project, because that's what the law requires, the PFMA requires.
Thanks. Thank you, Chairperson. Yes, in 2012-13 financial year, I'm at the supplementary statement, number 6, page 6. There was infrastructure enhancement allocation was made available of 41.851 million.
Sorry, which page are you on?
I'm now on 7.
Page 7,
Yes, of the supplementary.
paragraph B.
Yes.
Yes, IEAs, okay. I'm with you.
Yes. So agriculture did receive 41.8 for infrastructure enhancement allocation.
Yes,
The overall budget made provision for, the overall budget was 579.482 million, prioritizing amongst others Muma Mubung, development of an agriculture master plan and refurbishment of veterinary laboratories. Then there was the presentation dealing with the infrastructure projects. That was on 7 March and 4 April, respectively, 2012 now.
yes.
Agriculture only presented on the 4th of April, and that supplementary, the next year is 5A, which confirmed a budget of 13 million.
Yes. What I would like to understand is where the 114 million for the 2012-2013 financial year came from. I don't know if you're able to lead us to those particular numbers. If it's something you'd rather do first thing in the morning, again, I'm quite comfortable with that. Because I think the information is spread between the two affidavits.
It's between the two affidavits, yeah. If we can deal with that in the morning, it might be easier.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay.
Can I then ask you to please take the chairman back to your original affidavit, that's volume A. Take the chairman through what you refer to as the critical decision points of an annual budget process. And I assume you mean by this that it should be regular and within the framework of the law. These are must-dos. And I point you here to paragraphs 1.8.1 to 1.8.4, possibly, of your affidavit, if I have it right.
Thank you, Chair. Essentially, there's prioritization stage, which happens between April to September, where we determine priorities to be implemented over a forthcoming financial year and the MTF. That gets drawn from your national priorities, your outcome-based priorities, what was in your strategic framework, and so forth. Then it's preparation and review of for the medium-term expenditure framework. That's between April and August. National and provincial departments. July, August, it's what I've referred to previously as the July and August National Treasury visits. We look at a macroeconomic fiscal framework. There's the division of revenue between the three spheres of government. During I think it's around August every year. That is where there's a special cabinet meeting which considers the recommendations of National Treasury. It would have gone through the whole process now of consultation within the different MECs, within the different intergovernmental forums relating to different sectors. The Budget Council would have met. That's the Minister of Finance with all the MECs, Finance, SALGAs represented there. We also meet as Budget Forum then with the MECs of Gupta. Then there's a special cabinet meeting that gets called, it's every year, and Premiers and MECs Finance are invited to attend a part of that. So Cabinet more or less finalizes, then Premiers and MECs come in, the Minister of Finance does the briefing, indicating these are our challenges, this is the direction we want to take. Premiers, MECs can make input to say, but we can't continue carrying the impact of improvement of conditions of service. We have this priority, that priority, but fundamentally that is the overall allocations is decided in that meeting.
And you have to then go back to your provinces and work within that framework.
Yes. If you thought you were going to get 100 Rand and you only got 75, it was now your job to go back, start cutting back projects, informing departments. Unfortunately, we cannot accommodate this, that, and whatever. So go back, review, make your adjustments, defer projects, scale down projects, look at different phases, look at different implementation models, see where we can gain efficiencies, and so forth and so forth. So it becomes a technical process, but you need political buy-in from all your MECs, not only in the Free State, but in every other province. I'm sure the Minister of Finance had that battle at national government level to get everyone on board, to understand that there really is an end to money. We don't have unlimited sources of funding. Then we would go through the MTech hearings. In our case, National Treasury in all provinces, National Treasury participates in provincial MTech hearings. But we would also, if there were specific areas of concern, like in our case, we would standardly invite the National Department of Health for a health session, the Department of Basic Education for education, human settlements for human settlements. So you would invite your national counterparts to get a broader understanding of what our challenges are, but also from their perspective, what they think we should be doing better or more efficiently. It's quite a dynamic process then.
Without cutting you short, can I ask you to skip through some of the other material and go down to 1.8.10, which I think directly relates to the provincial treasury?
Yes.
And that fits in with the oversight issues that we've been dealing with today.
Yes, just to conclude, that process of the budget would then culminate after PMTech hearings. You go to through your adjustment budget process, and that concludes almost a financial year. In our case, we still gave room around December for departments. Everyone protects their money, and we would bring either a second adjustment appropriation or a special adjustment appropriation where we cleaned out any possible underspending and reallocated. That concludes then the whole budget process by a certain financial year.
Can you correct me if I'm wrong? The most important thing about any reallocation or readjustment of the budget is it can only be done in terms of Section 31 of the PFMA.
Yes,
those are the bases on which you can ask for more or shift monies around, etc., etc.
Yes, PFMA spells it out quite clearly. Unforeseen, unavoidable expenditure, emergency funding, money that may have become available to the province, conditional grant rollovers, which usually happens after the main budget is approved. And then your technicalities, your defraying of expenditure between votes and savings, and you can shift money within your budget. In terms of the Act, it would not be expected that you introduce an entirely new project in an adjustment budget, because that undermines the purpose of why you did your annual performance plan. It's systematic. Government likes systems and processes, and we walk smoothly until we reach a stage where we can properly plan and make budget provision.
You know, I'm sure I misunderstood Mr. Tabete, but my recollection seems to be that, and I'll check this, Chairman, that he said that the Estina Vrede project, the shortfall was brought to one of these adjustment budget processes. But that can't be right if you say you can't bring a new project into an adjustment process, unless I'm just not understanding something very well.
I think it was that first year.
Yes, correct. It would be in the first
It
year.
would be the first year where it was underfunded. So it
Correct.
was not an entirely new project, but to come up with the difference in the funding required, that was a quantum that would have been challenging for Treasury.
Oh, so they were quite entitled as Department of Agriculture and Rural Development to come to the adjustment process and say, we have a project, we had under-budgeted for it, and if there is money available, can you move something around and make sure that we have sufficient funds?
That's correct, because at the time the submission was approved in June 2012, they had amended their Table B5 infrastructure project list, Chairperson. So if that project on that project list is not created on the system, you are unable to allocate and transfer funding in respect of those projects. So the problem was that it was substantially underfunded,
Yes.
but they did bring it in marginally with
Yes.
a 13 million issue.
And they were entitled to do so. So his evidence was actually quite consistent with what you're saying, that they were able to bring it and they got whatever you were able to give them.
Yes, you could not have done it if it was
No.
not in the APP or nowhere at all.
Yeah. No, that helps clear that particular issue up. Then I was then just asking you to very briefly look at 1.8.10 on page 12, which I believe is consistent with the oversight issues we've been raising.
Yes, that is now financial governance processes. That process is led by our Provincial Accountant General. At the time, that was Mrs. Fourie. I think I've made reference to the key control matrix reports, the engagements with the Auditor General, engagements with the CFO forums. We do reviews of the draft annual financial statements, give feedback to departments to say you need to amend, adjust, correct. Whether they do or don't has a direct impact on your audit process.
If they ignore your advice, there's nothing you can do about that
They pay the price in audit,
in audit.
yes, in
With-
audit outcome.
But of course, anyway, we'll talk about that tomorrow. They then engage audit and tell audit why they believe they've complied and agreed to differ with audit.
Yes.
I really am talking about facts that relate to Estina, but we'll deal with them
Yeah.
in the morning. So that's not a particularly effective stick, because they can literally just argue and say, we are right. If you think we're wrong, tough cookies.
A lot of it is technical interpretation, and there is a lot of constructive engagements, Chairperson, with the Office of the Auditor General, Treasury, and the department. But if a department is adamant that they are right, there is little we can do to force an accounting officer to reclassify, for example, expenditure. That we don't have that capacity or
So-
power.
Again, by way of example, this is precisely why National Treasury had to intervene and issue a new directive in relation to how to classify goods and services and how to classify transfer payments.
Yes, that's correct.
So it came from the top to be
Yes.
able to regulate what happened at province.
Yes, because ultimately the ultimate authority is the National Accountant General and the Accounting Standards Board. So if all of us small people here sit and disagree with each other, you defer to the authority, the proper authority. Absolutely.
The last couple are that the asset and liability component, that's the same one that Mr. Myberg, for instance, was a part of, that went to do the inspection, the site visit at Vrede.
I'm not 100% sure whether at that stage There was a small restructuring internally in Treasury. I think at one stage, the budget component overlapped with asset and liability, but later it separated. So sustainable resource management became our budget division, and Mr. Meiberg was part of that. And asset and liabilities was about provincial asset and liability management. They, for example, would take care of transversal contracts and so forth, which had nothing to do with the sustainable resource management unit.
But again, just to make this a practical example, when we get to dealing with the assets of the Vrede Dairy project, as at August 2014 when the Free State Development Corporation took over, this is the unit that ought to be involved in discussions around who those assets belong to. Would that be correct?
No, that would be between the relevant asset divisions of departments that are affected, but with us, the Provincial Accountant General played a much stronger role. That is why when the agreement was finally cancelled, Provincial Accountant General was the one coordinating with Public Works to say, this agreement is cancelled. Make sure that you disclose the land that was part of this land use agreement or the 99-year lease agreement. That was taken up in the asset register of Public Works. Our Provincial Accountant General and the state law advisors made sure that that was done. It had little to do with our asset and liability unit. We treated it as a matter arising from audit and the Audit Intervention Committee, and therefore the PAG and the state law advisors was driving that process, together with the CFO of Public Works. Agriculture had no role to play because Public Works own all land on behalf of government. We would not transfer the land to agriculture.
That clarifies the point on land, but if you look at tractors, cattle, buildings at the Vrede Dairy Farm, there is a debate, or there was a debate about who those assets belong to. We'll deal with it in detail tomorrow. I just want to understand Provincial Treasury's role in helping clarify who those assets would actually belong to.
Our advice at the time is that, because it's almost inventory items, it's not assets, that the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development should bring it into their annual financial statements as work in progress until the beneficiaries had come on board or whatever matters were finalized, and it would then be transferred to the beneficiaries. But the vacuum that then was created is that there's all these assets lying around after the termination of the Estina agreement, but no one is disclosing it anyway. It was not FDC's responsibility because they were not appointed to take over the assets. They were there to manage the assets. So the feeling and the advice from Provincial Treasury was, agriculture, bring this into your financial statements, at least disclose it as work in progress. For various reasons, they did not accept that advice.
We will debate that tomorrow, particularly in the context of implementing agents, what their functions are, who they are, whose assets they're handling, et cetera, and I think that will fit into that particular. If you don't mind, you'll go back to giving us this example. We'll deal with it in that manner. Chair, that takes us to page 15 of this document, and I can safely stop here because we then deal with other issues that covers that budgeting process.
Yes, we'll stop here. Tomorrow you said you think we'll finish by lunchtime. I would like us to finish within 1.5 hours, at the most 2 hours.
I think it can be done, Chair.
But not because of anything, just because of my thinking that a lot of things are not in dispute. Okay, all right.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We'll adjourn now, and they will start at 10 o'clock.
Yes, Chair.
Let's start at 10 o'clock. We'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn.
All rise.